Good afternoon. Welcome to the Heritage Foundation and our Lewis Lehrman Auditorium. We, of course, welcome those who join us on all of these occasions on our heritage.org website. Would ask everyone here in-house to be so kind to check your cell phones and see that they've been turned off as we prepare to begin. We will, of course, post the program on the Heritage homepage following today's presentation for your future reference, and our internet viewers are always welcome to send questions or comments, simply emailing us at speaker@heritage.org. Ronald Reagan experienced several beginnings in his career history, whether starting as a radio broadcaster in Iowa, becoming a successful Hollywood actor, serving as spokesman for the General Electric Company, hosting a #1 rated television program, becoming governor of California, and seeking the presidency. Each of these adds a specific new piece to our understanding of the man and his character, and we continue to learn more about him even as we will be today. Our guest author, Thomas C. Reed, was present at more than one of these beginnings, and in today's book, The Reagan Enigma, shares his personal archives for the first time, having shared them with so many others in the past. Mr. Reed served as Secretary of the Air Force during the Ford and Carter administrations, was the youngest ever director of the once covert National Reconnaissance Office, and later served President Reagan as Special Assistant to the President for National Security Policy. His technical background includes nuclear weapon design and low-temperature physics, which we are getting ready to experience tomorrow, I believe, in Washington. He has advised the Joint Strategic Planning Staff on policy and intelligence matters. He has also authored 3 books, At the Abyss, The Nuclear Express, and The Tehran Triangle, documenting the history of the Cold War and its principal players. As a fellow Reagan administration alumni member, I am always pleased to welcome my former colleagues, and we do so today. Tom, it's a pleasure to have you at Heritage. We look forward to your remarks.
Thank you very much, John. Thanks to all of you. Very good of you. I'm glad the snowstorm did not come, so you could all come out to play. It is good to be here. That John talked about the book I've written, but I think a little consumer warning that the Reagan Enigma is not another I was there book. It's not a phony biography filled with fictional people that never really existed. It is not hero worship hagiography. The Reagan Enigma is a publication by a distinguished research university, the University of Southern California, that explores the topics of what made Reagan tick, which many other authors have written about, but none of them got it right. So let's give it a try. Let's start at the beginning, 50 years ago. 50 years ago, Reagan's political opponents described him as a dumb actor. 30 years ago, Clark Clifford called him an amiable dunce. They were all wrong. Ronald Reagan was not an actor. He was a master of the political stage. Think Winston Churchill in the Battle of Britain. Think Henry V at Agincourt. Ronald Reagan was a master of the political stage. His mind was immense. It operated at 10 times the speed of us mortals. That's what all those people missed. His mind was immense. Reagan was, in fact, the great communicator. He was known that way because of his performances on television, but the trick to his career is he was the great communicator with everybody. Example, in 1966, his first campaign for governor, I was the northern chairman, and I was taking him up to Northern California to meet the editor of a small-town paper in Healdsburg, the Healdsburg Tribune. On the way up, being an eager young man, I briefed him on the problems of water in Sonoma County. The Corps of Engineers wanted to reverse the flow of the Eagle River, all that kind of stuff. We get to the Healdsburg Tribune, and my view, he is ready to talk about these big issues. The editor comes out, beaming, and I look in the door. Holy mackerel, there's blood all over the floor, wooden floor. There's 2 halves of a writhing snake still on the floor. This man has just killed a rattlesnake on the floor of his office. Reagan never missed a beat. He comes in laughing and starts talking about, rattlesnakes are dangerous critters. He talks about the best way to deal with rattlesnakes. He talked about a rattlesnake that had spooked his horse on the trail. His host at the Healdsburg Tribune talked about they're in here all the time and so forth. We never talked about the Eel River. Never. We didn't talk about Round Valley. We didn't talk about water. Ronald Reagan established a rapport with that fellow, and when we left, Reagan and the editor of the Healdsburg Tribune were handshaking and hugging and laughing. They were friends for life, and of course, the man in Healdsburg took good care of us in the news. That's the kind of man that Ronald Reagan was. He was amiable. He was very amiable. He was fun to be with. He was lots of fun to be with. But strangely enough, he had few close friends. In my years of companionship with Reagan, we never talked about his hopes and dreams, his kids' achievements, his financial woes, if any, his health. We never talked about any of these things because Reagan had no close personal friends, which really seems strange, but that is the way I think it was. His daughter, Maureen, wrote about that trait in her memoirs, in talking about his relationship with his wife, Nancy. Maureen wrote, quote, "Sorry, Nancy, you're not his best friend. His horse is his best friend." That's the way he was. His press secretary, Lynn Nofsinger, put it more succinctly in his memoirs, quote, "Reagan would have made a superb hermit." Exactly. Seems strange. Reagan had no friends, but he had compartmented allies. Bill Clark was one. He was a fellow cowboy that Clark in the early days helped run the state government. He was close with Ed Meese, who is here today and one of your colleagues. Ed was a counselor, but I'm not sure he would classify himself as a friend. Reagan had pastors that he talked about higher beings. He trusted me with his political life. He was wonderful in that regard. When we decided to do something in a campaign, we're going to go do X. There was no second guessing, no micromanaging. He trusted me absolutely with his political life, but I was not a friend. Nancy was his lover and his wife, but in time she became the keeper of the bubble. She became the surrogate for Nancy's protective mother, Nell. Neither Nancy nor any of the rest of us were really Reagan friends. Nancy confirmed that in her memoirs. She said, quote, "Ronnie doesn't let anybody get too close. There's a wall around him. I feel that barrier." John Sears, who was a campaign manager during the 70s, said, quote, "As the second son of an alcoholic, Reagan grew up being a people pleaser, a loner. That's how he coped." Reagan was an upbeat man. He was pleasant to be with, but part of that was every story had to have a happy ending. In the case of a defeat, the incident had to be erased, to be forgotten. He simply could not mentally deal with defeats. He wanted every story to have a happy ending. Example, from his own memoirs, Reagan wrote, quote, "Running for president in 1968 was the last thing on my mind. I wasn't interested." That's absolute baloney. I ran that campaign, 1968. By the summer of 68, we were flying around in a 727 jet with 40 newsies in the back of the plane. In August, we're in Miami in sweltering hot trailers with no windows, trying to break Nixon's hold on those delegation chairmen. And yet, basically, Reagan said it wasn't a campaign. I wasn't there. That's because while it was a campaign, it didn't work, and therefore it needed to be erased. And that's why I believe he wrote as he did in his memoirs. Fast forward to Iran-Contra, the same phenomena. After all the documentation and committee reports, nonetheless, Reagan said to the American people, quote, "I did not trade arms for hostages. My heart still tells me that is so." Interestingly enough, Ronald Reagan was devoid of political ambition. He knew what he believed in, and he knew what he wanted people to follow, but he was not drunk with the thoughts of power. Unlike Lyndon Johnson, unlike Richard Nixon, Reagan had no lust for power. He found the perks of office to be funny. I think Ed Meese will confirm that. He thought the trinkets that went being with governor were funny. He thought, when I first traveled with him with Nixon, he thought that those accoutrements of power were funny. He really didn't have a driving political ambition. He was competitive, and we'll come to that in a minute, but he wasn't ambitious. It was Nancy that provided the driving ambition. One early report comes from Reagan's son Michael, who heard a conversation shouted down the hallway from their home in 1965. Nancy was shouting, "If you don't run for governor, Ronnie, I want a divorce." Now, she didn't mean that, of course, but the point is that evidence that the drive came from her. Fast forward to the inauguration run-up in 1981, Johnny Carson coined the moniker Nancita to equate Nancy's ambitions with those of Eva Peron. Exactly. I agree. Without Nancy, Ronald Reagan never would have been elected to anything. She was the one with the driving ambition, not Ron. Another misunderstood aspect of the Reagan story is his conversion from New Deal Democrat to Eisenhower Republican. That was not just an instantaneous flash. It occurred over a decade. During the early 40s, while fighting communist infiltration into the Screen Actors Guild, Reagan was threatened over the phone with an acid-in-the-face attack if he persisted in blocking the communist penetration of the Union. In response, Burbank Police Department offered protection, and they also offered a concealed weapon permit. Not well understood is during the years that Reagan was head of the Screen Actors Guild, he was also packing heat. Reagan came to understand the folly that the lofty ideals of communism simply could not be enforced without terror. That was part of his conversion. Further political movement came in the early 50s with the Korean War. Reagan's enthusiasm for Roosevelt transferred to Harry Truman. He believed in Harry Truman. But as the Korean War dragged on, Reagan grew concerned. That war began in June of 1950 with the North's invasion of the South. But 2 years later, there was no end in sight. The Korean War had become a mindless meat grinder, a lot like the war in Vietnam a generation later. In the spring of that year, 1952, Reagan wrote to his war hero, Dwight Eisenhower, urging Eisenhower to seek the presidency. The general welcomed that offer of support. Reagan campaigned on Ike's behalf in 1952. He continued again in 1956, and he then worked for Eisenhower's designated successor, Richard Nixon, in 1960, but always as a concerned Democrat. It was only in 1962, a decade after his original connection with Eisenhower, that Reagan re-registered as a Republican. And that was, as he put it, because his party had left him, not the other way around. Interestingly enough, as a result of that relationship, Eisenhower became a Reagan mentor, not well known. Those men developed a solid relationship, and at the end of '64, at the end of Reagan's time for choosing speech, at the time of Reagan's time for choosing speech, Eisenhower began to pay attention because the Reagan performance stood in stark contrast to the harsh Goldwater defeat of '64. At year's end, Reagan was seeking to rebuild the Republican Party. Eisenhower and Reagan had stayed in touch through the years. They exchanged letters, then phone calls, and eventually personal visits. They stayed in touch through Ike's last visit to Palm Desert in the spring of 1969. The concept of peace through strength was probably born during those conversations. I was not there for many of those conversations, for some, but we know of all these because of the records, the letters and the telecon records that are at the Eisenhower Library in Abilene, Kansas. Reagan had a hero in the form of Eisenhower, but he also had a villain. Not well understood is the arch villain in Reagan's life was Robert Kennedy. He became Reagan's supreme nemesis for unusual reasons. In 1961, upon becoming his brother's attorney general, Bobby Kennedy pursued corruption with a vengeance. As a sidebar, he also targeted political opponents. In February of '62, Kennedy hauled Reagan before a grand jury. 2 weeks later, after that, the Justice Department subpoenaed Reagan's tax returns. The matter never resulted in an indictment, but in April of that year, Reagan lost his job as host of the General Electric Theater. Reagan's teenage kids got that news over lunch one Sunday. I just lost my job, the future president told his son Michael. The Kennedys threatened General Electric. His daughter Maureen confirmed that conversation in her memoirs, saying, quote, Bobby Kennedy had a hand in this cancellation. Now, this may not be accurate, that other reporters have pointed out that the General Electric Theater was losing ratings, but that's not what counts. What counts is in Reagan's mind, Bobby Kennedy had leaned on General Electric and had caused the cancellation of the General Electric Theater and the loss of Reagan's job. He sought retribution in 1967 during a Telstar debate with Bobby Kennedy and a bunch of students that were television sitting in Europe. But Reagan went all out when Kennedy entered the presidential campaign sweepstakes in 1968, is when Reagan really got actively involved in campaigning for the presidential nomination. It was when Kennedy jumped in 68. And then he relented upon Kennedy's death. Reagan was a very religious man. His minister, Stuart McBurney, was one of the half dozen people present in September of 65 at the kickoff meeting in Reagan's home when Reagan's career really crystallized. My insight to that relationship comes from a conversation with Bill Clark that I had in late 1981. Bill Clark had been serving as Deputy Secretary of State. He was getting ready to move to the White House to become the National Security Advisor. In December of that year, I was having coffee with Bill in the State Department conference room. We were just brainstorming, Bill, what are you going to do? What's your objective? What's your to-do list when you get to the White House? Well, he said, without missing a beat, I want to remove the communist oversight. I want to free Eastern Europe from communist control. Well, I thought that's really an interesting ambition. That's going to be kind of hard to do. How do you plan to do that? He pushed himself back from his table and said, we have a secret weapon. Oh, really? What's that? He reached in his pocket, pulled out a crucifix, and slammed it on the table. Okay, he understood. He was a believing Catholic, an active Catholic. 5 months later, Bill Clark arranged for Reagan to meet with the Polish-born Pope to discuss putting in peace the pieces, the components for destabilizing Poland and eventually the disintegration of communist control in Poland. Reagan was an avid reader of the Bible. He read Revelations, and his fear of Armageddon was a prime force in his determination to end the Cold War. As we noted earlier, Reagan was devoid of political ambition, but on the other hand, very differently, once into a contest, be it for public office or for the survival of the free world, Reagan was an absolutely uncompromising competitor. Mike Deaver said in his memoirs, quote, Reagan was the toughest competitor I've ever known. And that's how the Cold War phased out. That's how it played itself out, with that spirit of not accepting second prizes ever. This all came to I was involved in January of 1982. That was after Reagan dealt with the economy. In 82, he recruited Bill Clark and myself to come to the White House to help with national security matters. One of the first mornings I was there, I'd known him very well, and we were talking about silly things that dictators had done in republics far away. We got through, he peered over his glasses, as he was wont to do, and he said, Tom, we have a problem. Yes. I thought he was talking about the air conditioning doesn't work. Tom, we got a problem. Yes, sir. What is that? The Soviet Union. Yes, that's a problem. Tom, why don't you get the fellows together and figure out how we're going to end the Cold War? Holy mackerel. Okay. We talked about the pieces of all that, and I ended the conversation in thinking about, I'm going to get this guy from state and those people from defense. I was just the chief clerk. But I closed the conversation with, Mr. President, what's the end game here? Oh, that's simple, Tom. We win, they lose. period. That's the way he was. So during the next few months, we put together a plan that was articulated in a document called NSDD 32, Decision Directive 32, which was a plan for prevailing in the Cold War. The war was to be waged at a lot of fronts: economic, technical, political. But the end, at the paper, we thought through what's the objective, and we wrote down what's the objective, what's the end game. Bob Gates, who was a terrific Secretary of Defense, came to write about if you get into a fight, you really need to think about how you're going to get back out. What's the end? And so we thought that through. And we concluded, tanks in Red Square pulling down statues of Lenin is not the objective. And so in Decision Directive 32, we wrote our definition of victory. We seek to convince the leadership of the Soviet Union to turn their attention inward, to seek the legitimacy that comes only from the consent of the governed, and thus to address the hopes and dreams of their own people. That's exactly the way it turned out. Reagan's immense mind understood the failings of the Soviet system. He was a good enough political chess player to exploit those failings while he was connecting with a Soviet leader who had no choice but to seek the consent of his governed. Reagan's vast mind and his ability to connect with anybody, anywhere, were the keys to understanding the Reagan Enigma. Thank you. Your turn.
25 minutes, like you said. We do have a microphone. If you would please raise your hand, I'll be glad to call on you, and we would appreciate you at least giving your name and an affiliation if you're so comfortable. And Andrew, I'll start down here with a known problem.
Tom, thank you for being here. Peter Husey. I'm now hanging out at the Air Force Association and the American Foreign Policy Council. You have written 2 books, At the Abyss and The Nuclear Express, about the threat of nuclear terrorism. And I was wondering if you could give us a very brief update from where you ended off in those 2 books of whether we've made progress or lack thereof.
Well, the question is about have we made progress with nuclear terrorism. That, in a way, is a long way from the Reagan Enigma, but on the other hand, it's key because Ronald Reagan read Revelations. He believed, he feared Armageddon on his watch, and therefore that was what drove him to, we got to end the Cold War. It was a driving force in the Strategic Defense Initiative and so forth. I think we have, we've made progress because as the introduction to these books that you inquired about, the books are dedicated to the Cold Warriors. At the Abyss is dedicated to the Cold Warriors on both sides who fought the Cold War in a lot of local skirmishes in a belief of their own gods, but at no time was a nuclear weapon fired. That's really an achievement, that we have come a great way to see that weapons are safe, they're under control. The problem is there's always the possibility of a screwball getting hands on a weapon, but not likely. They may get their hand on fissionable materials. The real problem is there's one Muslim state, Pakistan, that has nuclear weapons. Even in the run-up to 9/11, the Al-Qaeda people tried to make a deal with the Pakistani nuclear types. They didn't succeed, but the problem of a nuke and nuclear materials getting into bad guys' hands is real. The problem is not a weapon being stolen. That's not going to happen. That the nations that control nuclear weapons, us, the Soviets, they all got serial numbers. We know where they are. They are so locked up that we can have a nuke here and you can't make it go off. The problem is fissionable materials in the hands of people willing to build a low-tech weapon and float it into the harbor. That's the problem. That's the problem that remains. Yes, sir. I can hear you without the mic.
Yes, but the world can't.
Al Milliken, AM Media. Did you ever have the opportunity to talk with Ronald Reagan about his divorce from Jane Wyman? In looking over the legal documents, I guess he was accused of extreme mental cruelty, but my understanding, from what I've learned, is that he really didn't contest that whatsoever. And I was wondering what you found out about that.
Well, to two things I talked about. One, he had no friends, which means he never talked about that to me. On the other hand, the book, The Reagan Enigma, is really fact-based. It's published by a university. The introduction is written by the president of the university. It is fact-based. One of the sources for the book was Stuart Spencer, who basically was the political genius. He was the political strategist that won every election that Reagan won. Stu did talk to Jane Wyman as he was getting ready to run the first campaign. That he met with Jane Wyman and talked about Ronald Reagan, and she was very forthcoming about their relationship. She wished him well, but she made it very clear that there was no acrimony, there was no difficulties. It was just that Ron got more and more interested in politics, and her career was diverging into stardom. She did quote one of her fellow stars in Hollywood who said, quote, "Don't ask Ronnie what time it is, he'll tell you how the watch is made." And I think that was her problem. There was no acrimony that I ever saw. Yes,
And
sir.
here in front. Just
Bill
wait for the mic, yeah,
Thank
Thanks,
you very
Bill.
much, Bill Glacken. You mentioned he was a Catholic?
no.
No, Bill Clark was a
Oh,
Catholic.
All right, I was wondering about that.
No, Reagan was very religious. He believed in a higher being, which is really the contrast is government is not the higher being. There is a higher being that deals with right and wrong and higher purposes, and he believed in a higher being. He didn't care what particular building you went to. He didn't associate with any particular religion. He had ministers from the very beginning. As I said, Stuart McBurney was there in September of '65 when it kicked off. Other ministers, became close over the years. He believed in a higher being, which is why he did not believe that government was the answer and that communism was the archetype of all that. But he was not secular in any particular way. Bill Clark was.
Yes, down here in front. Just a second.
Just a question for you.
Wait for the mic, please. Thank you.
My name is Bill Malusky. I just came back from a very long time in China. I'm curious, if Reagan were alive today, what do you think his approach would be to dealing with the Communist Party in China?
Well, the question of what would Reagan do today often pops up, and it is essentially unanswerable because times are very different. You can only apply his mindset. He would have, he had an immense mind, and he could connect with people. That's what you really miss. I think that if Reagan were alive today, he would look at the problem, and the same thing. He would assemble the bright guys like Ed Meese and say, let's put together a plan. He would put together a plan for dealing with it. He would not do it ad hoc. And whether it is China or other confrontations, Ronald Reagan clearly would say, here's the problem. You guys put together a plan. He would listen to it, say yes, yes, no, and then he would pursue it. And that was his strength.
Tom, you mentioned in the discussion Nell, his mother, briefly, and then you mentioned in the book his father. Do you want to at least share a little of your thinking about the fact, of course, that we know his father had an alcohol problem, and in some ways what the president did was either withdrew into knowledge and books and learning, or escapism, some would argue, with the radio personality, the television, and all of that. What do you think about his upbringing?
John, that moves from what I know to what I believe, and I've tried in the book to be meticulous about what I know. But two of the researchers for the book, as we plowed through this, why was Ron always wanting to please people? Why did he not want angst around him? Why did he not connect with friends? Two of my researchers said, Tom, that's because his father was an alcoholic. We are adult children of alcoholics. And let me tell you how it works. These folks gave me a couple of books, one by a fellow, a doctor named Kritzberg, about how children of alcoholics react. And I have to come to believe, which isn't a fact, I come to believe that the fact that Reagan was the child of an alcoholic led him to really not connect with other people and to want happy endings to every story. I can't prove it, But I've had people, once I wrote the book, some really senior people have come to me and said, yeah, you got it exactly right. My father was an alcoholic, and I don't trust people. So I think that his father was a happy alcoholic. He just couldn't keep a job. He was not beating the dog and so forth. He just, Ron talked about pulling him off the porch and getting him into bed. But he also talked about his mother, Nell, who was absolutely the patron saint, who dealt with, they were essentially homeless in Illinois, and that Nell was the mother that dealt with all this and kept the family together. And I think that upbringing had a lot to do with his inability and unwillingness to connect. But when we're all over,
Far side?
Ed Meese got to know him longer than I did. I knew him earlier, so I have seniority on Ed, but only by a few weeks.
Over to the far left, Tom.
And Ed was really, to praise your, he and I are the surviving colleagues, that Ed's title was counselor, and that was really important because Ed Meese was there to really brainstorm through what we're going to do. And Ed made indispensable contributions to the success of Reagan's administration and the end of the Cold War. Thank
Yes,
you,
sir.
Ed.
Gregory Andrews, intern at the Heritage Foundation.
Far left.
Sorry, over here. My question, what elements of Eisenhower's foreign policy influenced Reagan's philosophy on foreign policy, if any?
The question is the Eisenhower's influence on Reagan. That is a relationship that nobody really understands. It got to be quite close. That, as I said, after the '64 election, Eisenhower looked at the famous speech, just like a lot of us did, and said, here's somebody who makes sense. Eisenhower wanted to rebuild the party. And so he began to connect with a lot of people. He first asked his golf playing buddies in Los Angeles, I've met Ron, but tell me about him. I mean, does he make sense? We know all this because of the letters in the Eisenhower library. He then started talking to Reagan, and he then met with him. I was there, we went to the Eisenhower Ranch in Gettysburg after Reagan won the primary, and Eisenhower began to give advice about politics. But they also talked about national security. A lot of times, and we know from the notes of those conversations, they talked often about Vietnam. Bear in mind, this is 65, 66, 67. This was a key issue. They talked about Vietnam, and that Eisenhower's observations were bad idea to get into a land war in Asia, but if you get in any war, you got to plan to win it. And he was really disdainful of the Johnson approach to a slice at a time, gradualism, and we'll teach them lessons. That Eisenhower's one quote was, there's a company holding a hill, give me a division and I'll take it without any casualties. Eisenhower message to Reagan was if you're going to get involved, think through why. Don't do it without an end game. But if you do get involved, full force all the way. And I believe that the concept of peace through strength came from that relationship. It was a close relationship.
Far back, just a minute.
Bonner Cohen, National Center for Public Policy Research. Did the Ronald Reagan you knew, particularly the one who occupied the White House, have a sense of his place in history? And if he did, how did he see his place in history? Thank you.
I'm sorry, did he see a place in what?
Have a sense of his place in history.
A sense of his place in history.
Oh, did Reagan have a sense of his place in history? I think absolutely. He understood the big picture. He had an immense mind. I mean, I don't mean kind of big, immense. And it was fast. It was 10 times faster than us mortals here. That's what all the opponents never understood. He had this huge cataloging mind to understand everything. When he was going to have a confrontation with Bobby Kennedy, we told you about his antipathy for Kennedy in the politics of 1967, CBS thought up the great idea of let's have Kennedy and Reagan in television studios talking to students in Europe, and so they agreed. Reagan agreed to do that. Now, getting ready for that, he closeted himself for a week with the history of Vietnam. Was Ho Chi Minh in Versailles? What was he doing there? What was the history of the war in Vietnam? Who were the casualties? What was the North doing to the South? He spent a week studying that. And then, in the last day before, he practiced in a quasi-studio, just as you do for a presidential debate. One of the senior staff played Bobby Kennedy. Others in the staff were abrasive students. He really prepared and thought it through because he understood history. He really understood the sweep of history, and that's why he understood that the Cold War cannot go on forever. In writing this book, I'm fortunate to have met or knew a lot of former presidents. And in talking to them, I asked, Mr. President, Mr. Ford, how did you envision the Cold War ending? Well, all of these gentlemen said, once I got there, the threat of nuclear annihilation was so terrible, I really became focused on not letting that happen. Well, how did you envision the Cold War ending? Well, the Soviet system is broken and it will collapse, and I believe in containment. But none of those presidents really had a thought as to how is the Cold War going to end. Reagan had a respect for history and the sweep of history, and he knew it had to end, and he determined to make it happen his way.
I think Bonner may have been asking a second aspect of the president. I agree with you. He did understand history and had a sense of it and what we could do, but he didn't have an egotistical sense of where he was in history. Do you think he was the most?
No, absolutely not. That, as I said, he was devoid of political ambition. I mean, you can't believe that in a president, but I believe he was devoid of political ambition. He knew what he believed, and that was not negotiable. He would negotiate with legislators over the edges, but he knew what he believed, and he propounded that. And if the people want to follow, that's just fine. But if not, I'm going to get on my horse. And so he was not an egomaniac. He was not a Lyndon Johnson. I want my place in history. That he thought all that was kind of funny. I think. I think I ought to give Ed Meese rebuttal.
Do we have
time.
another question? Just a minute, Al. Anybody else? Okay, we'll do one more with Al.
Al Milliken again. What is your understanding of his connection with astrology? Obviously, Nancy seemed very involved and influential in that regard, but how do you see him in connection with that?
The question is Reagan's connection with astrology. I think it was essentially zero. That Nancy was his lover, wife, but she became the protector and the keeper of the bubble. And therefore, all the things that she talked about, he was very thoughtful of. But when it came involved with her involvement in affairs of state, he absolutely tuned her out. Example, Stu Spencer tells me of having dinner upstairs in the White House after he had just given the Evil Empire speech. And Nancy was on his case about, you can't say that. That's terrible. We've got to have détente and friendly. We got to get along with the Soviets. And Ron was eating dinner, and Stu Spencer was there. He turned to Stu and said, Stu, what do you think of the Evil Empire speech? And Spencer said approximately, well, Mr. President, you're going to scare a lot of people. It's true. It is an evil empire, but you're going to scare a lot of people. And without missing a beat, he says, well, Stu, it is an evil empire. We're going to push him over backwards. What's for dessert, Mommy? He basically viewed all the astrology stuff as, part of what Nancy was doing, and that's nice, but he was not impacted at all.
Well, I have one more over here.
How did President Reagan's sense of humor play in his role as an enigma?
How did Reagan's sense of humor? He had an enormous sense of humor, and how did it play into the enigma? Well, I think it was the escape route for not talking about the serious stuff. That he regularly talked about movies, and that drove his wife nuts. But we understood that. That was the history that he thought about. When we were talking about some issue, and suddenly he's talking about Gary Cooper and High Noon. That's not a divergence. He's saying, let's do what's right. It may be dangerous. Let's leave the honors to others. He talked about Grace Kelly. He's not talking about some lady from Monaco. He's admiring a woman who sticks with her husband no matter what. And so he, when faced with places he didn't want to go conversationally, he used the movies to make the point, or he would turn to humor, because it was an escape route, I think, for not going into the dark corners.
We'll do one more down here. Just wait for the mic for our outline. Thank you.
How do you think his age affected his presidency?
How did Reagan's age affect his presidency? I really don't know the answer to that. You'll have to ask others, because I was there to do particular things I wanted to do. I was a special assistant to the president for national security policy. We put together the plan for ending the Cold War, a few other things that I think were important, but I left in 1983. He was certainly very hale and hearty, and what happened during the second administration, I just have no firsthand knowledge. And as I said in talking about the Reagan Enigma, I'm really pleased that I wrote about facts, not what I believe.
And of course, in the first administration, he gained muscle mass after he went into training after the assassination recovery. So in your 70s, that's no small accomplishment. We do thank you, Tom, for this special look. And as he does say, it is a very fact-based, very interesting focus on a period of the president's life that we don't often see as clearly. We do thank you again for coming to join us, and thank Tom.
Thank you for having me.